The day after the funeral, when the house finally fell silent and the flowers began to wilt in their vases, Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by the remnants of a life she thought she understood, sorting through envelopes and documents, not because she was searching for anything specific, but because stillness felt unbearable. And it was there, tucked inside an old folder marked insurance, that she noticed a name she did not recognize, followed by an address in a city he had never mentioned. And at first she dismissed it as a clerical mistake, yet the longer she stared at the unfamiliar details, the more a quiet unease settled in her chest. Because for 40 years she had known her husband as a careful, predictable man, someone who hated secrets and valued routine. And the idea that there might have been a part of his life she had never seen felt less like suspicion and more like a slow fracture in the foundation of her memories. And as the afternoon light shifted across the room, she realized that grief was no longer the only thing she was carrying, because curiosity, once awakened, does not ask permission. And something inside her knew that this small discovery was not accidental, that it was the beginning of a truth she had never been meant to find, but could no longer ignore. That night, Margaret lay awake long after the house had gone silent, staring at the faint reflection of herself in the darkened window, thinking about how grief does not arrive all at once, but seeps slowly into the corners of memory. And as the hours passed, she began revisiting moments from her marriage that once felt ordinary, but now returned with an unfamiliar weight. The evenings he came home distracted yet gentle, the way he avoided certain questions without ever raising suspicion, the quiet routines they shared that felt solid precisely because they were never examined too closely. And she realized that for years she had mistaken consistency for transparency, believing that love meant not asking too many questions. And as this thought settled in her chest, she understood that what frightened her most was not the possibility that he had kept something from her, but the deeper realization that she had willingly accepted silence as a form of safety. And by the time dawn softened the edges of the room, she was no longer debating whether to open the folder, but confronting the truth that whatever it contained had already shaped her life, even if she had refused to name it. The drive to the address listed on the document felt unreal, as if she were moving through someone else's memory rather than her own present. And with every mile, Margaret rehearsed reasons to turn back, telling herself that some truths arrived too late to be useful. Yet when she finally stood on the unfamiliar doorstep and a woman answered the door with a look that carried both recognition and restraint, Margaret understood that this encounter had been waiting for her longer than she had known. And as they sat together, exchanging measured words, the story unfolded not as a dramatic confession, but as a quiet accumulation of choices made over decades, choices shaped by fear, obligation, and a desire to preserve appearances rather than confront consequences. And Margaret listened not with anger, but with a strange clarity, realizing that betrayal does not always look like passion or deceit, but often takes the form of emotional absence, of lives lived carefully side by side without ever fully colliding. And when she left that house, she carried no desire to expose or punish, only the heavy awareness that silence, when prolonged long enough, becomes its own form of truth. As Margaret drove home, the road stretching endlessly ahead of her, she felt an unfamiliar calm settle beneath the ache, because the story she had feared was now complete, and while its shape was painful, it was no longer undefined. And she began to see her marriage not as a lie, but as a carefully managed compromise, shaped by a generation that valued endurance over honesty. And she recognized that both love and omission had coexisted in her life without canceling one another. And this realization brought a bittersweet dignity, because it allowed her to grieve not only the man she lost, but the version of herself who had believed that loyalty required silence. And as the afternoon light shifted across the windshield, she understood that clarity does not erase years of devotion, but it does return agency to the one who was never given the full story. And for the first time since his death, she felt grounded rather than suspended between doubt and memory. Weeks later, while sorting through the last remaining boxes in the quiet house, Margaret paused over a photograph taken decades earlier, a version of herself smiling without reservation, unaware of how layered love could become over time. And she held the image carefully, not with regret, but with compassion, recognizing that the woman she had been made the best choices she could with the information she had, and that ignorance had not made her weak, but human. And as she placed the photo back into its box, she felt something shift, because the truth she carried now belonged entirely to her, no longer hidden in documents or half-spoken explanations. And while the future ahead felt uncertain, it also felt honest. And in that honesty, she sensed a quiet strength forming, one built not on resentment or closure, but on the understanding that even late revelations can serve a purpose, not by changing the past, but by allowing the rest of life to be lived without illusion. In the days that followed, Margaret noticed how the house itself seemed to respond to her growing awareness. Every familiar sound carrying a different meaning, the ticking clock no longer marking time, but emphasizing how much of it had passed unnoticed. And as she moved through the rooms, she began to remember moments she had once dismissed as insignificant, pauses in conversation, changes in tone, evenings when he seemed present yet unreachable. And she realized that memory is not static, but rearranges itself when new truth enters, illuminating details that were always there but never fully seen. And she found herself sitting for long stretches simply thinking, not trying to justify or condemn, but allowing the story of her life to unfold honestly for the first time, understanding that denial had once protected her from pain, but had also limited her ability to truly know the person she shared decades with. And as this awareness deepened, she felt both grief and relief intertwine. Because while the loss became heavier, the confusion that once surrounded it slowly began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet, grounded understanding that clarity, even when late, carries its own form of dignity. One afternoon, while walking through the neighborhood she had lived in for most of her adult life, Margaret became acutely aware of how little the world around her had changed despite the internal shift she was experiencing. Neighbors greeting her with familiar kindness, routines continuing uninterrupted. And this contrast made her realize how personal truth often exists independently of public perception, how entire emotional histories can remain invisible to everyone except the one who carries them. And as she passed houses filled with their own unspoken stories, she understood that many lives are constructed on partial truths, not out of malice, but out of fear of what honesty might unravel. And this realization softened her anger further, replacing it with a broader empathy, because she could now see her marriage as part of a larger pattern shaped by social expectations, generational silence, and the belief that endurance was more valuable than emotional transparency. And by the time she returned home, she felt less isolated in her experience, recognizing that her story, while painful, was not unique, and that this shared human tendency toward concealment did not excuse hurt, but explained it in a way that allowed her to move forward without bitterness. Late one evening, unable to sleep, Margaret revisited old letters and documents she had once preserved simply as keepsakes, reading them now with a perspective shaped by what she had learned. And she noticed how language itself revealed careful restraint, affection expressed without vulnerability, commitments affirmed without emotional exposure. And this pattern mirrored the life she had lived, one built on stability rather than intimacy. And as she read, she felt a profound sadness, not for what had been hidden, but for what had never been fully shared, realizing that the greatest loss was not betrayal, but the absence of emotional courage on both sides. and she acknowledged her own role in maintaining this distance, recognizing that she too had avoided questions that might have disrupted the balance she relied upon. And this mutual silence now appeared not as failure, but as a choice shaped by fear, comfort, and the desire to preserve harmony. And as dawn approached, she felt something shift again, because accountability, when shared honestly with oneself, loses its power to wound and instead becomes a foundation for growth. As weeks turned into months, Margaret began to experience subtle changes in how she related to others, finding herself more willing to speak plainly, to express discomfort rather than smooth it over, and to allow conversations to remain unresolved rather than rushing toward false reassurance. And she noticed how this honesty altered her interactions, creating moments of discomfort, but also moments of genuine connection she had rarely experienced before. And she understood that while the truth she uncovered could not change her past, it was actively reshaping her present, influencing how she chose to exist in the world moving forward. And this realization gave her a sense of agency she had not felt in years, because for the first time, her choices were guided not by habit or expectation, but by awareness. And she recognized that growth does not always arrive through dramatic transformation, but often through quiet shifts in perception that slowly redefine how one understands love, responsibility, and self-worth. That afternoon, Margaret remained seated at the same spot by the window for a long time, watching the slow movement of shadows across the floor. Not because she was tired, but because her thoughts had finally reached a depth that demanded stillness. And as she sat there, she began to understand how easily a life can be shaped by what is left unsaid, how entire decades can pass inside routines that feel safe precisely because they are never questioned. And she thought about how often she had sensed something was slightly misaligned, yet convinced herself it was normal, that every long relationship contained quiet spaces that should not be disturbed. And now those same spaces felt heavier, not accusatory, just undeniable. And she found herself replaying ordinary conversations from years ago, moments when she chose agreement over curiosity, when she softened her reactions to avoid tension, when she postponed uncomfortable truths in favor of stability. And what struck her most was not regret, but recognition, the realization that she had actively participated in maintaining a version of reality that required her to shrink parts of herself. And this awareness did not arrive with panic or urgency, but with a slow, grounding clarity. Because for the first time, she was not trying to decide what to do next. She was simply allowing herself to see fully, without rushing toward resolution. And as the hours passed, she understood that this stage of knowing was necessary, that before any conversation, any decision, any movement forward, there had to be a moment where truth was allowed to exist without action, where understanding was not immediately turned into response. And in that quiet, she noticed how her breathing steadied, how her thoughts became less reactive and more deliberate. And she realized that strength does not always announce itself through confrontation or change. Sometimes it appears as the ability to sit with discomfort without escaping it, to remain present with uncertainty without filling it with false answers. And as evening approached, she felt something settle inside her. Not acceptance and not closure, but readiness, the kind that forms slowly when a person stops negotiating with what they already know. Later that evening, as the house slowly filled with the familiar sounds of dusk, Margaret moved through each room with a heightened awareness, noticing details she had overlooked for years. The way the furniture was arranged to accommodate someone else's habits, the routines built around preferences that were never questioned. And she realized how subtly a shared life can be shaped around compromise until it becomes difficult to distinguish where one person ends and the other begins. And this realization stirred a quiet discomfort because she understood that much of what she called harmony had been carefully maintained by her own restraint, by choosing predictability over expression. And as she paused in the hallway, she remembered moments when she had almost spoken, almost asked questions that lingered just beneath the surface, only to dismiss them as unnecessary or selfish. And now those moments returned not as accusations, but as evidence of how deeply she had internalized the belief that stability required silence. And she found herself wondering how different things might have felt if she had trusted her instincts earlier. Yet this thought did not spiral into regret, because she now saw that self-awareness unfolds at its own pace, often delayed by responsibility, fear, and the desire to preserve what appears to be working. And as she sat down again, she allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by reaction, but intention, one where her thoughts no longer needed to be filtered or postponed. And this imagining felt both unfamiliar and grounding, because for the first time she was not centering her choices around maintaining balance for someone else, but around understanding herself fully. And in that quiet process, she sensed a shift occurring, not dramatic or visible, but structural, like the slow realignment of something that had been off-center for a long time. And she knew that whatever came next would be approached differently, not with urgency or fear, but with the steady clarity of someone who had finally stopped minimizing her own inner voice. In the days that followed, nothing outwardly dramatic occurred. No confrontations, no sudden departures, no definitive lines drawn in public. Yet internally, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion forming, because the need to explain herself had quietly dissolved, and she understood that closure does not always arrive through answers or apologies, but through the moment one stops carrying questions that no longer serve a purpose. And as she continued with her daily routines, she noticed how her reactions had changed, how familiar situations no longer triggered the same tension, because she was no longer negotiating her worth internally. And this shift allowed her to observe rather than absorb, to listen without shrinking, and to speak without rehearsing every word in advance. And she recognized that the strength she felt was not newly acquired, but reclaimed, something that had been present all along but muted by years of accommodation. And as she reflected on the past, she did so without bitterness, seeing it as a necessary passage rather than a mistake, understanding that growth often requires time spent in confusion before clarity becomes possible. And what surprised her most was the absence of anger, replaced instead by a calm acceptance that felt earned. And as she stood by the window one evening, watching the world move forward without acknowledging her internal transformation, she felt aligned in a way she had not before, because she was no longer waiting for permission to live honestly. And though uncertainty remained about what the future would bring, it no longer frightened her, since she trusted herself to meet it fully. And with that trust came a quiet peace, not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that integrates it into understanding. And in that understanding, she felt whole, not because everything was resolved, but because she finally was.